1970s New York City. A place where both decadence and decay were intertwined into a world city that was on the verge of collapse. Movies such as Taxi Driver and the original Death Wish are prime examples of this era of New York. While most people were going to Studio 54, or trying to get into Studio 54, there was another music scene that was brewing. A music scene for the people that were far from the elitist mindset. It was known as punk. However, there was one band in particular that stood out from the rest of the scene. They didn't have a bass player, or a drummer, or even a guitarist. Yet they were also one of the more vicious and confrontational. This is the history of Suicide. It was 1971. A Brooklyn-born man by the name of Alan Bermowitz was quite literally a starving artist. He helped build an art center called the Museum of the Project of Living Artists, located in Greenwich Village. He not only displayed his own art, but he also lived in the facility as well. On one rainy day, a Bronx-born man named Martin Reverby entered the gallery. The two hit it off immediately. The two eventually started making music together, but there was a problem. They had barely any equipment. Martin was a jazz-trained pianist who possessed only a cheap $10 Japanese keyboard. At the time, however, they thought that's all they needed. The nature of the sound they were aiming for was a soundtrack of their lives living on the streets. They needed a sound that not only reflected their daily hunger pains, but also their decaying urban surroundings. Naturally, they weren't getting the sound they needed from a cheap keyboard, so they managed to scurry up enough resources to get some cheap effects modules. These gave Martin's keyboard not only a boost in volume, but also a more unnerving, harsh sound. Alan's singing, on the other hand, was, quite literally, from another era, as Alan was more influenced by rockabilly artists such as Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison. This naturally gave the band a distinct retro sound. However, these two elements in their sonic repertoire put them into two separate camps, one in music's past and the other into music's eventual future. Alan Bermowitz chose to go by the stage name Alan Vega, while Martin Reverby went with the name Martin Rev. The only other name they needed was for the band itself. Vega was a fan of the Marvel Comics series Ghost Rider. One story of the series carried the title Satan's Suicide. A friend of theirs found the word Satan offensive, so they just went with Suicide. Suicide's early gigs were brutal to say the least. When the audience gave them hell, they gave them hell back. To quote Martin Rev, "All the hostility we were getting did nothing to change that. Even when the violence was going on and the blood was spilling, I'd be thinking that the crowd knew we were doing something from the future, but it wasn't a future they wanted to know about." Alan Vega would eventually start carrying a large motorcycle chain with him on stage, just to add more intimidation to their image. To paraphrase Vega, the idea was for people to come into the show to escape the filthy streets of New York, only for the poor soul to get a bigger blast of urban decay once inside. In 1975, Rev got a hold of a vintage drum machine, adding minimal doses of percussion to their sound. Also around this time, other bands from the punk scene were getting signed on for record deals with major labels. Suicide, however, were not one of them, as they were considered bottom of the barrel, so to speak, compared to others from the New York scene. However, one man, Marty Thau, took a chance with Suicide. Thau was originally the manager of the New York Dolls. He started a new record label, Red Star Records. And not only did he sign them on, he, along with notable music producer Craig Leon, helped produce their debut. Since Suicide spent a half a decade performing live and creating an abundance of music, the recording sessions went rather smoothly. During production, producer Craig Leon added delay effects to Vega's vocal tracks, giving the album a more distinct, haunting feel. This gave particular tracks, such as the infamous Frankie Teardrop, with its disturbing lyrical subject matter, a more blood-curdling sound. Suicide's debut self-titled album was released in December of 1977. Not only did the album fail to chart, at the time of its initial release, it was not well received by critics either. However, not all was lost, as the band managed to score some opening gigs for some notable artists. Unfortunately, these opening slots didn't go too smoothly either. At one infamous show, opening for Elvis Costello in Brussels, Belgium, Suicide was only able to stay on stage for roughly 23 minutes. During this incident, Suicide's confrontational style only fueled the audience's seething impatience. This not only ended with the audience stealing Vega's microphone, but also a promoter coming out and saying there will be no show if this behavior continues. Unfortunately, this did nothing, as Suicide was not only booed off stage, but Vega also received a broken nose from the incident as well. Elvis Costello was so upset with how the audience treated Suicide that when he came on stage he played a short angry set that set the entire audience into a literal riot. This particular show was not only recorded but was given a commercial release as 23 minutes in Brussels. This, however, was not the peak of the brutality the band would soon encounter during this tour. At a show opening for The Clash in Glasgow, Scotland, Alan Vega was a hair away from getting a hatchet to the face. Also at another gig in Metz, France, an audience member threw a wrench, scoring a direct hit at Alan's head. Alan claimed he still had the scar decades later. During a tour opening for the Cars, Suicide caught the eye of Michael Zilka of Z Records. Z Records was a unique label at the time, signing notable no-wave acts such as Lydia Lunch, James White and the Blacks, Mars, and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. In January of 1980, production began on Suicide's second album, this time being produced by Rick Ocasek of the Cars. For their second album, Suicide obtained access to a much higher-end studio, hence giving them a notable equipment upgrade. This allowed Martin Rev and Rick Ocasek to experiment more with various sounds and ideas. This also allowed Vega to focus more on vocals. Suicide, Alan Vega and Martin Rev, also known as the second album, was released in May of that year. While the album got noticeably higher marks by critics, it still failed to achieve any substantial sales numbers. Because of the dismal sales numbers of the second album, Suicide went on hiatus. During this time, Alan Vega and Martin Rev would go on to release solo efforts. Alan Vega would go on to make 4 studio albums and a live album. Vega would also perform on television in countries such as France and Spain, obtaining a respectable-sized audience in Europe. Martin Rev also released solo material during this time period, a self-titled debut in 1980 and a follow-up in 1985. In 1987, Suicide reunited to record a third album. This album was also produced by Rick Ocasek. In 1988, Suicide released their third album titled A Way of Life. A music video was shot for the track Dominic Christ. The band also performed on French television. At the time of its release, A Way of Life was not well received, especially by the audience. The album was released on Wax Trax, a label known for producing such acts as Ministry, KMFDM, Frontline Assembly, and several others of the 80s 90s industrial scene. Buyers, seeing the Wax Trax logo on the back, expecting Suicide sounding like other label alumni, were disappointed to say the least. Alan Vega would go on to release 2 more studio albums. Martin Rev released a third solo release. In 1992, Suicide released YB Blue. This album has a notably more optimistic sound to it. This would be their last album produced by Rick Ocasek. This was also going to be Suicide's last studio album for 10 years. After several solo releases by Vega and Rev, the two finally got back together for what was going to be their final album, 2002's self-produced American Supreme. Reviews were generally mixed, some giving the album near perfect scores while others giving it below average at best. Some called the album brave for bringing modern influences such as hip-hop and 90s rave sounds to the mix, while others say it made the album sound dated. Even though Suicide never achieved any mainstream success, their influence can't be denied. From acts such as New Order and Depeche Mode, to Radiohead and R.E.M., they had notable fans, such as Henry Rollins, music producer Steve Albini, and Bruce Springsteen. Over the past few decades, there have been countless covers and renditions of their music. Their song Dream Baby Dream was recently used in a Marc Jacobs ad. Suicide's debut album on its initial release was scoffed at by critics, but now is considered quite groundbreaking, often grabbing respectable spots on greatest albums of all time lists. Even some of their follow-up albums are getting more attention and garnering more acclaim. Unfortunately, some of their albums are climbing up in price. Luckily, most, if not all of their recordings are on Spotify. Because of Alan Vega's failing health, with both a heart attack and a stroke in 2012, Suicide decided to put on one final performance. It was on July 9, 2015 in London's Barbican Hall. Several guests appeared, including Henry Rollins and Primal Scream's Bobby Gillespie. On July 16, 2016, Alan Vega passed away in his sleep. In 2016, many famous musicians died. but Alan Vega was barely, if ever, mentioned. But one of the more interesting things about Vega's death was his age. In a 2005 biography, Suicide, No Compromises, Vega claimed to have been born in 1948, but in reality, he was born 10 years earlier, in 1938, which means during the release of Suicide's first album, he was almost 40 years old. While other people his age in the 1970s were raising families in the suburbs and saving up for retirement, Vega was fighting among street thugs and other violent individuals who were literally out for blood at their shows. Crazy? Perhaps. One of the coolest old people to have ever existed? Most definitely. Even though Suicide are no more, their music and image will always be influential, grabbing new fans, audiences, and inspiring several others. Though no artist will live forever, their work will echo on, hence making them, in a sense, immortal.